Okay, we're live. I'm going to cover, again, chapter 6 and 7. The title of, what is the chapter of title 6? Deserter in a Time of War, I think. Let me make sure I got that right. Yeah, a deserter in time of war. This is the chapter where we get Unk deserting the army of Mars. We learn he's the only person who ever deserted the army of Mars, the short-lived army of Mars. And why does he desert the army? A little pop quiz, I guess. Who can tell me? So he throws some grenade. They're all marching single file to go to their plane, their flying saucer, to go attack Earth. But Unk has other plans. He has a distraction. He throws a grenade and runs off to do what? What did we learn about last time? He read a letter at the end of chapter 5, right? He read that letter. Yeah.
I think he steals a ship.
He's gonna try to, but he doesn't do that. No, he doesn't do that. He's looking for someone. Who's he looking for?
For his
wife or his mate,
his kid.
Yeah, his mate. Yeah. His son Chrono and B, his so-called mate. What is this? What is the encounter like? Is it very fruitful, successful when he goes to meet them?
No.
Yes. Yeah. No, not at all. Yeah, it's pretty lame, right? I think Chronos kind of comes off as a total brat. You know, like to me, he comes off like a real brat. But I don't know if that's what Vonnegut is intending. If he's supposed to be like a total brat, or if he's just kind of like, you know, kind of lackadaisical, doesn't care. All he cares about is his German bat ball. You know, he's just some naive kid, or maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe he's a brat and the other. You know, he's a bit naive here. Let's review real quickly before we get into these two chapters. There's not, to be honest, there's not a lot philosophically going on. You could argue in these two chapters. There's just a lot of plot. There's a lot of plot going on, and so we learn, you know, about what's happening, and the plot advances quite a bit in chapter 6 and 7. Don't know that we add a whole lot of depth to the philosophy of the book, but I'm gonna actually dig in a little bit and explore, I think, a little deeper some themes that we've already encountered earlier on. I'm gonna kind of revisit those to I guess fill out the class, because like I said, these two chapters, they're fun and they're kind of exciting and dramatic, but they don't add, I would say, a layer of philosophy so much to the book, at least yet. I don't know, there's a couple profound things that are said. You know, what is it? Beatrice, or they really just call her B for short. Most of the book she's just referred to as B. B is the only poet, and I guess Unk is the only philosopher who that were ever produced on Mars. The only Martian poet and the only Martian philosopher. What's behind that? That's a good question. You know, what is it about them that allowed them to create, to be creative? I guess philosophy is a sort of creation, in a sense, or at least it's a reflective engagement, a sort of deeper engagement, not with just the superficialities of life, but what is it all about? You know, what's the deeper meaning? I guess you could argue that that's philosophy. The only two characters, you know, out of this, I don't know, I forgot the number, but there's like something like 250,000 or 500,000 people purportedly on Mars in the book. And out of all that, only two, you know, Mars was only able to produce these two. There was really no culture on Mars, I suppose. But again, just to review real briefly the characters. So we got Winston Niles Rumford, who does show up again in these chapters. We finally kind of learn towards the end of chapter 7, or towards like kind of the middle of chapter 7, why he's doing all the stuff that he's doing, why he's organizing this army on Mars, why he's planning on invading Earth. And so we kind of learn a little bit more about him, or at least his actions, what the reasons behind his activities. Who remembers, or it's really close to the end of the reading, so maybe some of you didn't get that far, but why is he doing all this stuff? What does he think he's going to accomplish after he knows that the invasion of Earth is going to fail? He knows that they're not going to win, and a bunch of innocent people will die. So he's basically sending them to their death. It's a suicide mission. But why does he do it? Why does he feel justified in doing this? What does he think it's going to bring about on Earth? Nobody picked that thing. Nobody picked that up from the reading. Well, I guess we'll have to wait until we get to it today. But yeah, he's wrong. I think he's been misled. You're going to find out at the end of the book that he's been a bit deceived. But he's under the impression that this invasion of Earth is going to accomplish something grand, something really good. So we'll talk about that when we get to it, I guess. But I was hoping some of y'all figured it out. I guess not. So there's he's sort of the first main character we're introduced to in chapter 1. And then probably the more important character is Unk, or Malachi Constant. And he's the wealthiest man on Earth. At this point, he's Unk. He's Unk from here on out. And he's escaped. He's deserted the Martian army, and he's off to meet with Beatrice, or B as she's called, right? So I'm going to skip Ransom and the Reverend Bobby Denton because they're not the most important characters. Same thing with Helmholtz and Miss Wiley. Unk, let me put this in parentheses. Unk, again, is just Malachi. It's Malachi. After his brain has been sort of wiped, his memories are cleared, and now he's just Unk, this deserter from the Martian army who loves who needs to reunite somehow. He's got to get back together with his mate, his wife B, and his son Chrono. That's his mission in life. And then there's Boaz. What's Boaz's mission in life? So Unk wants to be reunited with his family. What does Boaz want?
He wants to go to Hollywood nightclubs
Yeah,
and have that aesthetic life.
Right. Yeah. I guess if you want to, you're kind of using Kierkegaard speak, but yeah, he's sort of the aesthetic, right? He wants the Hollywood nightclub. I like that answer though. His dream is the Hollywood nightclub. Yes, I should capitalize Hollywood. It's proper noun. So so Boaz is kind of latched on to Unk, and he thinks that Unk is going to be his ticket to paradise when they get to Earth. Once the Martian army conquers Earth, he doesn't know about these places, but Unk used to back when he was Malachi. So he's going to kind of show him around. Then we meet Chrono very briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on Chrono. He'll come up later towards the end of the book. But he's just this sort of curious kid, right? And Unk sneaks to his school and has this confrontation with them, and he's just sort of doesn't give a toss. He's like, I don't care. He seems sort of apathetic, right? But let me find the page number here where Chrono comes in. And before Unk can even say anything to him, I think he says something like, whatever you're going to say is just a bunch of baloney or something like that. Yeah, whatever you say, it's baloney, said the 8-year-old. What makes you think so? Everything anybody says is baloney, said Chrono. What you care what I think anyway? So we learned that the kids on Mars haven't had their brains washed, I guess, yet. It's not safe till they're a certain age. So he's only 8 and he hasn't had this done to him. And I'm guessing maybe he can kind of see through the fact that all the adults are kind of robots. They all have antennas in their head and they're being controlled by remote. And, this is the one thing about children. I think the wisdom of children is a bit overrated. People, the children, they're so, wise and listen to the children. You hear these kind of wishy-washy sentiments all the time, and that kind of makes my eyes roll. But there's some truth to it. I think children kind of see through fakeness. They can kind of tell when the adults are full of crap, you know. Mommy, why you lying to me? You know, they kind of see through it, at least by the time they're 8. They get this sort of sense of justice. So I think, you know, maybe that's why Chrono is such a brat, is such a sort of, everyone's full of crap around here. Y'all are all full of baloney. Plus, two, we find out he's the star of the team. So he's this, like, the most popular kid in school. So this probably boosts his ego a bit. So maybe he's just kind of he's got the attitude of a teenager, even though he's 8, right? Thinks he's the boss and he's just cooler than a cucumber. But after Unk fails miserably with Chrono, he moves on to B, and he fails miserably with her, and he starts to lose oxygen, right? He starts to, like, because on Mars you can't breathe, you have to take what they call goofballs, and there's a very odd scene where he goes to visit B, his mate, at the school. She's a teacher. She teaches people how to breathe without breathing, right? To absorb oxygen using these goofballs. And so he walks in on her, and there are all these people kind of tied up to machines to regulate their breathing. And again, his meeting just falls flat. She's just kind of like confused and sort of out of it. And she even kind of believes him, but she just doesn't care. So it seems like, you know, these Martians, for lack of a better word, I guess that they're former Earthlings, you know, once their mind and their memories are kind of erased and they have nothing left but just their sort of bare functioning, they're able to kind of function. They all become kind of like default nihilists. They just sort of like, yeah, whatever. Nothing really draws them in. They don't really care about anything. I don't know. Just I'm kind of conjecturing here. Maybe I'm defending B and Chrono against him. Like, geez, it seems like they would act a little bit more dramatic in this situation, but they're all very sort of flippant, nonchalant, just big deal. She's more annoyed. She's kind of like when she realizes that the military police are searching the building, they can kind of hear him coming down the hallway looking for Unk. She's kind of relieved, and he tries to hide himself and fails miserably. He is knocked out unconscious, and then he wakes up again. And when he wakes up again, he's in the back of this mothership with Boaz. And well, Boaz isn't there yet. Boaz shows up in a minute, but he's with the guy with the dog, right? The man who shows up with the dog. And we all know now, the reader knows that's Winston Rumford. And he's, you know, looking at Unk and kind of shaking his head. And we'll get to that scene in a minute. But before we do, there's another character who is quite weird, who I wouldn't say we really meet him yet, but he's mentioned here, and we're going to meet him later. But the name of the character is Salo. I think that's how you're supposed to say that. Maybe it's Salo or Salo or something, but I always hear Salo in my mind when I'm reading it. Who is Salo? Who remembers that? I think it's on 138 where he's first introduced. They're talking about all the months on Mars, because there's more months on Mars than there are on Earth. And one of the names of the months is Salo. And it's named after this person, or I don't even want to say it's a person. It's a character, I suppose. I think he's referred to as a creature by the author. No one remembers, or no one's... Guys, are y'all not doing the reading, or are you just reading it too fast and not picking up on this stuff?
Can you ask the question one more time?
Who's Salo? S-A-L-O. There's a character named Salo who's mentioned actually a couple times. The first time they're mentioned is on 138. And then again, closer to the end of the reading. Yeah, like around 175. So close to the beginning, close to the end. You nobody remembers Salo?
Is it a creature that Rumford knew on Titan?
Right. So he's this alien who's on Titan, okay? Who's waiting on Titan, and we all know that that's the end destination for Malachi or for Unk, whatever you want to call him at this point. I don't care, right? Malachi, Unk, same person. But yeah, we all know that Unk is eventually going to be on Titan, and Salo is there as well. So this is on 138. This is the first time you hear about him. The month of Salo was named after a creature Winston Niles Rumford knew on Titan. Titan, of course, is an extremely pleasant moon of Saturn. Salo, Rumford's crony on Titan, was a messenger from another galaxy who was forced down on Titan by the failure of a part in his spaceship's power plant. He was waiting for a replacement part. He had been waiting patiently for 2,000 years. His ship was powered, and the Martian war effort was powered by a phenomenon known as UWTB, or the universal will to become. UWTB is what makes the universe out of nothingness, that makes nothingness insist on becoming somethingness. And I guess this is probably the most philosophical part of the reading for this class, for this meeting, for chapter 6 and 7, is this notion of the UTWB. This is like the chronosynclastic infundibulum. This is another interesting invention by the author, and it's never really explained. At least the chronosynclastic infundibulum, it may be hard to pronounce and hard to remember the word, but at least he tried to explain it. There's a whole 2 or 3 page passage, but he never really explains what the heck this stuff is supposed to be. All he says is it's what makes nothingness insist on becoming somethingness. You know, I love that. It's what makes the universe out of nothing. This is something that theologians, philosophers, literary critics, just curious people, they often point to these parallels that you find in ancient mythology or ancient religions that have been around for a long time. You find at the beginning, there's always this void. If you read, for instance, the Greek poet Hesiod and his Theogony, he talks about this void that first becomes something because of a tension or a sort of chaos or an urge, and then there's a burst, and everything sort of is created from that chaos. Of course, in the Bible, the beginning, light and dark are separated from nothingness. In the beginning, God was alone. It was nothing, and then there was light, right? In fact, this just came to my mind. Remember that the Bible is referenced quite a bit in this book. I hated to read too much into it because I know Vonnegut was not a very religious man. In fact, he was very outspoken, kind of against religion. He seemed to think that religion made people hate each other. It caused war. It was, try to give us easy answers, and when we could, or try to give us these deep answers that were sort of misleading. So I think Vonnegut himself was a critic of religion, but he draws, I think, a lot from mythology. He had a degree in anthropology. That was his background. He studied anthropology, so he knew a lot about world religions and world mythology and all this stuff. And so, maybe there's this the universal will to become. It also, it sounds a little bit like. Well, let me put his name up here. I'm going to write it down. There's a philosopher named Leibniz. And Leibniz famously asks the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And his answer is, because God wanted there to be something. It's better that there's something than there's nothing. And so because it's better and God does what's best, then that's it. And there's more to the argument than that, but that's kind of basically Leibniz's overall conjecture. And he starts from this, something exists. We don't live, there's not a void. There's some, the world is here. Why is it here? And Vonnegut sort of gives us the answer. Well, because of this stuff. That's the answer. Because of UWTB. And apparently, this stuff can be saved up and stored. Like you can save this stuff up. The universal will to become. This is a fun metaphor, and there's a lot we can do with it here. I love what Vonnegut's doing. That you can see this as a sort of just having passion. That's sort of a word that I think Kierkegaard would use, having passion. If you're Heidegger, you might talk about care, this sort of impetus to be a drive, something that pushes you forward. This is what allows all things to have significance. And this is what Vonnegut's calling the universal will to become. And I think I got the acronym wrong, backwards here. UWTB on the slide, it's backwards there. So we'll learn more about the visitor from the other world, but we just know that he's stuck on Titan. He's waiting for a part for his ship for like 2,000 years. So this being can live for a long time. And we also find out that this is what is basically, what is it, powering the war effort on Mars. This alien has a storehouse of UWTB, and I guess he's given it to Rumford, and that's why they're able to do all these crazy grandiose things, even though they fail, I guess, in the end, right? The Martians don't ever conquer Earth. I'm skipping over quite a bit about Chrono, all right, about the sun. But this is important stuff, you guys, because, I'm skipping over it because it really has more to do with plot. But it's important because there's a few things about Chrono that are going to come up later that if you didn't catch them, you're going to kind of like, you're going to lose a joke. You're not going to get the joke. But Chrono is, again, he's this kid. He has this good luck piece, which is just like a little scrap of metal with a couple holes in it that he got when he was on some field trip. I don't know if I want to say anything more about Chrono because I'm afraid that I'm going to like spoil some of the story for you. Yeah, I guess I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, we're going to actually move on. I'm going to leave it at that. What I do want to talk about before we get into some of the other plot developments from chapter 6 and 7, one thing I want to get into is the notion of luck, the notion of fate, and a word that Vonnegut doesn't really use, but is sort of assumed here. I think he does use it once, but this notion of free will. He said something like Boaz had the freest will of anybody on Mars, or his will was as free as anybody's on Mars, unlike the others. Certainly someone can gather why he says that. Why does Boaz have more free will than the others? What is it about Boaz that's special, gives him an advantage? Y'all don't remember from last time? What does Boaz have in his pocket?
He has the mind controller, not the controller, but the pain.
Right, yeah.
The pain thing.
And I mean, no, you were right when you first said it. I mean, pretty much it's a mind controller, kind of, I guess. Well, I guess you were right to hesitate, because this is sort of the debate that I'm going to get at today is who really does have free will, right? Does anybody have free will? judging by your initial answer and your hesitancy to use that answer, oh no, free will doesn't control it controls pain in their brain. I'm assuming you kind of hesitate because like, well, they can still think what they want to think. They can still, their mind is still free, but how they act is not. Because if they don't act the way that Boaz or one of these commanders wants them to, then all that person has to do is push this little button, and then they'll feel that pain. And who cares what they want to do? They're going to do whatever the hell they're told. So in a way, you still, if that was sort of your reason for hesitancy, because you're thinking, well, they still have the freedom of thought, you know, they're still free to think. But
yeah, that's what I was thinking, because it's like they can still think on their own, and they can still do what they want outside of military things. Like that's why I think that's why Unc was able to kind of sneak away and write his letter to himself.
Right.
So I feel like they are not controlled completely. They are controlled, but they're not completely being taken over.
Yeah, and I'm in a way I'm kind of troubled by this, because I think maybe I'm being too hard on Vonnegut, and I'm this philosophy professor reading an English, this is like a book of fiction, whatever, and I'm expecting too much out of him. But he seems to, at least the way he presents the plot, and especially when we get to the end of the book and you kind of see how it all ends up, he seems to be a fatalist. I mentioned that term before, that there's a sort of fatalism in this book, a sort of fatalistic philosophy, and fatalism is just a type of determinism. So I'm going to lowercase it here on the slide and put it in parentheses. Determinism is not the same thing as fatalism. Fatalism is a type of determinism, and it's like the most extreme. It's basically like everything that happens had to happen that way. There's no way it could have happened otherwise. Where determinism is sort of like, well, it did have to happen that way, but it's possible it could have happened otherwise. The only thing that could have changed it is a different sequence of events led up to it. The idea is that everything that happens was caused by a preceding sequence of events. And so if something else would have happened before, then there would have been a different outcome. So, but because the events happened the way they did, that's why we have things the way they are. So if you're a determinist, whether you're a fatalist or a more like a little bit lighter form of a determinist, you're not going to believe in free will. You're going to think that free will is a bit of an illusion. People think they have free will, but they don't. As opposed to what a philosophy professor might call a libertarian. That's a word you don't hear as much in this context anymore, because I think it has so many political connotations. Whenever you hear the word libertarian, you're probably thinking about politics and political libertarians. But libertarianism in philosophy, we're usually talking about metaphysics, and we're talking about people who believe that people have free will, that humans have liberty. So, again, libertarianism is just sort of a belief in free will. And in these chapters on Mars, Vonnegut seems to be presenting us with the worldview of libertarianism. But I think if you look at the book as a whole, it's kind of a deterministic, it's all based on fate. There's not much you can do about it. Remember the first chapter, B and Malachi hear their fate and they don't like it. So they try everything they can to avoid it, and they can't avoid it. They're inevitably going to do what fate has in store for them. So again, it seems like Vonnegut is sort of advocating or purporting or presenting us with a very deterministic picture of the universe. But in this chapter, it's not so, it kind of seems to contradict, because it's like, yeah, he comes out and says Boaz was freer. I don't want to spend too much time on that. So, but if somebody wants to go find that passage, I know there's like one sentence where he uses the word will. He says Boaz had the, if you want to find that, let me know. But I swear it's there. But again, and you're going to find at the end of the 7th chapter, when Boaz and Unc end up in the spaceship together, and they're headed towards, well, Let me check your reading. Where are they headed? Are they headed towards Earth with everybody else? Where are they headed?
To Mercury?
Yeah, they're going to Mercury. They don't know it yet, but they'll find out. They eventually find out. And what happens? Unk actually, while Boaz is asleep, he's able to sort of take all that stuff out of he takes his little remote control out of his pocket and tears all the stuff out of it, stuffs it with tissue paper, and puts it back in his pocket. So basically, Boaz has no control over him anymore, right? And he's completely free. So again, there's this kind of like acknowledgement of free will, but at the same time, a denial of it. But I want to try to save Vonnegut here. Maybe Vonnegut wasn't a determinist. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe he wasn't a fatalist. And he certainly is not a hardcore libertarian in that sense that we have absolute control and free will. Maybe he's a compatibilist. I don't know. There's this third option, which is often attributed to someone like Aristotle. Although I think that's a bit inaccurate. Maybe it's not fair to use the word compatibilism, because compatibilism, historically, that word was coined in like the 1700s, 1800s, I think, late 1700s, something like David Hume. But you could argue that even though Aristotle didn't use that word, his view is kind of like that. So some people call this soft determinism. They don't use the word compatibilism. They say it's a soft determinism. And so, for Aristotle, some things come about. All things come about because of previous causes. So he's a determinist in that sense. But yet, you can still be responsible for your actions, because some things wouldn't have come about if you weren't a part of the chain, if you weren't a part of the causal chain. So in that sense, you are responsible. So the idea is, and so this is not like a bold assertion of free will. It's not really saying that you have freedom, but it does give you a sort of sense of responsibility. So I guess the idea is, if you're a determinist, you're going to be very strict about this. There's no free will. You may think you have free will. You might think that when you go in to buy some ice cream from Baskin Robbins, that you go in there, you look around, you look at all the different flavors, and you pick the one that you liked, and you used your free will because you like chocolate, so you picked chocolate, and that was your decision. Nobody forced you to do it. You decided to do it. Well, the determinist is going to say, well, who decided for you to like chocolate? Did you decide you liked chocolate? You didn't. You were determined to go in there and pick chocolate. Now, if you're a determinist today, you might say something like, you have a genetic predisposition to like chocolate. Maybe you had a traumatic experience with vanilla in your childhood, and that's why you like chocolate or whatever. But the point is that your actions, even though they seem to be your own, or you decided to make them, that ultimately you didn't decide what you desired. You didn't decide, that was something. I guess this is one way to put it, is that the person who defends free will, the way they define free will is being able to do whatever you want. I get to do whatever I want. I want to do it, I do it. So like in the example, the Martians that have the antennas in their head and are being controlled, they don't really have free will because they can't just do anything they want. They might be able to do free will, like they might have a little bit of free will if it's something like you were saying earlier that has nothing to do with the war effort, or it doesn't interfere with the grand scheme of things. But like, because they're controlled, they don't really have that free will. But if that were removed, if they were like Boaz, then they do have free will. Right? They can do whatever they want. There are other philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, and I hate to use him as an example because I think this is kind of a misinterpretation of his philosophy. And we don't really have time to get into his philosophy deep enough to be fair to him. But his view of freedom is pretty, Jean-Paul Sartre, his view of freedom is pretty robust. And he once wrote that a man who is on the way to the scaffold to be executed. The prisoner who's chained up, walking, is being, carried or walked to the scaffold to be killed. That man is just as free as you and I are sitting here talking about Vonnegut's novel, or watching the Zoom call. And that seems kind of an absurd thing to say. So Sartre would say that the Martians, like Unk and B, that have this antenna in their head and are being, tortured with these devices, they're just as free as the people that have those devices. And that's, again, that seems kind of like a bold claim. What he's going to say is, in the case of the prisoner who's on the way to be executed, their freedom is limited, but it's still completely up to them what they do with it. So because we aren't prisoners, right? We're not on the way to the scaffold to be executed. At least I hope not. Geez, if that's you, please unmute and let me see your video footage, and we'll try to call the governor to get you pardoned or whatever, right? But none of us are being executed right now. None of us are prisoners right now. So we can do more with our freedom. You can choose to ignore this meeting, hit the mute button and walk away and pretend you're here. You have a lot more that you can do with your freedom. You have more possibilities, but you're just as free, or sorry, the prisoner is just as free as you are. They have an infinite amount of possibilities. They can walk to the scaffold with their head held high in pride. I did it for my love, or I did it for my country, or I died for the right reason. Y'all think I'm a criminal, but it was for some political reason, and I'm proud of what I did. I fought fighting the good fight. Or the prisoner could scream and plead for help. Please, I didn't do it. I'm innocent. Please don't kill me. So there's a multiple amount of ways that the individual could react to these scenarios. And so for Sartre, it doesn't matter whether or not Boaz has this little device in his pocket. I think Sartre's a little, even though he's misrepresented a bit, I think he's a bit extreme, even when you read him the right way. It seems like if the pain is that severe that's being described in the novel, if it's that severe, the pain that Unk is so fearful of, is it really possible to just sort of like, through some monumental act of the will, to just sort of, it seems like our body has a limit, like this is why I think torture is so horrible, and why it's just not an effective means. I mean, I can understand why you might want it. Like if you're, somebody kidnapped your loved one, or there's a ticking time bomb, and you got the bad guy, and he won't tell you the secret. He won't tell you where your daughter's hidden or whatever. I can understand this is sort of a point. I think there's a philosopher named Zizek who makes this point, and I kind of agree. Like I can see the desire to want to beat up the bad guy and torture them and get them to reveal to you the truth. But for me, this is just irrational, because if you torture somebody and you physically submit them to absolute, excruciating pain, it seems to me like most people, you can get them to do about anything, And so I don't know. I mean, it seems like there's a limit to even if we do have free will, it's not absolute, right? Like even if there is such a thing as free will, and the determinists are wrong, there's got to be a breaking point where physics kicks in and even our mind can't be controlled, right? The pain is so hard that we turn into, if you've ever read the book by George Orwell, 1984, we turn into what's the character's name? Winston Smith. At the end of the book, he's worshiping Big Brother, and so even his spirit is broken. But anyways, I digress a little bit there. Let's talk a little bit about Aristotle and this compatibilist view, because I think maybe this is sort of this is the kind of understanding of freedom and fate and luck that Vonnegut is operating under, is sort of like, yeah, we're kind of at the mercy of fate, but we're also still responsible for how we react to that, how we take that in. And I skipped this quote. This is a sort of cliche quote. I'm sure some of you have heard it before. It's from I think originally the theologian, oh, what's his name? I forget, Niebuhr or something is the last name. I can't remember his first name. But, and this is not even the quote. It's always misquoted to sound more poetic than the original quote. But the quote is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So I think this might be a sentiment, well, partly a sentiment that Vonnegut is expressing in this book. Again, he's an atheist, so you probably should take the God part out. But it seems like the message, and when we finish the book next week or the week after, maybe you guys can tell me what you think is the message, if you think there's a different message. But I think this notion of serenity, and maybe to a lesser extent wisdom, I kind of still want to keep with a somewhat fatalistic interpretation of the book, because I think, for Vonnegut, some of this stuff couldn't be changed. It was inevitably going to happen. These characters were sort of the victims of fate. There's nothing they could have done about it. But of course, the way they responded to it, I guess he's giving them that. The way they responded. Do they have the serenity to accept their fate? And do they have the wisdom to know the difference between what they can change and what they can't? I think Boaz kind of figures this out by the end of chapter 7. He starts laughing, right? And in fact, this kind of makes me think of him. It kind of endears me to his character, the way he reacts to the situation. But I'll try to find that passage before we leave today. But very briefly, let's talk a little bit about Aristotle's theory. Okay, so in Aristotle's book, The Metaphysics, it's book 12 of the Metaphysics, he gives us a list of how all things that are come into being, right? How do things come into being? We know that Vonnegut sort of jokingly says it's just because of the universal will to become, right? The UWTB. But for Aristotle, there are 4 options: either through art, or the word in Greek is techne, or skill, art, craft. The second one is nature. Third is luck, and the fourth is spontaneity. And so, for Aristotle, certain things, one has a sort of understanding of the technique and is able to apply that understanding into an object. Okay, so the principle of movement, he says, is in something other than the thing being moved, other than the thing moved. So for instance, if I'm making a work of art or I'm making a building, I have a techne, a knowledge of it. I take some material, bricks, clay, whatever, and that thing is made into a building, work of art, etc., whatever. So the principle of movement, me, the artist, the creator, is in something other than the thing moved. In nature, the principle of movement is in the thing itself. So a flower grows, it moves towards the sun to draw nutrients. The roots draw nutrients from the soil. This is sort of the internal mechanism that's natural to this living thing. And Aristotle thought that was true of all living things. And this is something that we naturally gravitate towards. So in a sense, our nature makes us not so free in the sort of modern sense of that word. Then everything is sort of else is by either luck or spontaneity. Spontaneity being what he calls privation of nature. We do something that actually is against our nature that just sort of happens randomly, right? Like normally we might do one thing, but we do something completely off the cuff that, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Then we're walking down, when we walk, we sort of have a natural way of walking. But if we like decide to, just for some stupid reason, we like hear a song and then we just like start skipping for a minute, I guess that would be spontaneous. it wasn't a natural action of just sort of that came from our natural, when we walk, we don't think about, the one foot in front of the other. It just happens, naturally. Spontaneity is when something sort of breaks that pattern. Luck is predation of art. So things happen, not because we planned them to happen that way, but because they all just kind of fell together. Now, the more I explain this and think about it, the less I'm thinking it's a good way, because I'm thinking about the end of the book, and I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil it for you guys, but now I'm thinking about, geez, it seems like almost every character in this book is the victim of fate or luck. A little bit of art is involved, but there's really only one character, or maybe you might technically say a group of characters. I'm being vague for a reason because I don't want to spoil things for you. There's like one character, one group of characters who really seem to be sort of controlling anything, who really seem to be doing anything through art, through what Aristotle calls art. I hate to use that word art because you're thinking of artists and paintings and stuff, more like skill, through foresight, through technique. Most of it's just, these people think they're doing it through skill. And I guess that's one of the reasons why Boaz is laughing his ass off. I kind of love the Boaz character, to be honest with you, because I think it's a good example of having a good sense of humor about yourself. Because when he realizes how stupid he was and how he's been manipulated, he doesn't get angry. He just sort of says, "What the hell are you doing here in outer space, Boaz? What kind of trouble have you gotten yourself into?" It's a very, he's very forgiving of himself. And I admire that. I kind of wish I could be a little bit more like Boaz in that regard. So I'm gonna read this story that Rumford tells Unk right before he's about to take off in this spaceship with Boaz. This is pretty disturbing, right? So I guess I should warn you, if you haven't read this is pretty disturbing, and it's kind of hard to have much sympathy for that character, Unk, when you read the story. Oscar, did you want to say something real quick? I saw you unmuted yourself.
No, my bad.
Okay, I'm sorry. But yeah, so we're back to the scene where Unk is just, he tried to convince Chrono and B to run off with them. They were having none of it. He ends up getting himself stuck in the situation where the military police are coming in after him, and he passes out. And now, flash forward, he's in the back of this spacecraft, and he's staring up, and he sees this man. He thinks it might be Stoney Stevenson. Is this my best friend? He doesn't know that he still hasn't found out that Stoney is dead. Turns out that it's Rumford. And Rumford tells him a story, and the story is about himself. He doesn't know it at the time that it's about himself, but it is. And again, it's kind of a disturbing story, and I mean, there's parts of it that are kind of disturbing, and they make it really hard, I think, difficult to have much sympathy for this guy. We really don't like Malachi Constant to begin with. He's supposed to be kind of a sleazy playboy. He doesn't really care about anything. He's kind of a low life. I mean, he's rich, but he doesn't really contribute much. But when we read this part, it's really hard to forgive him, right? When we hear about this. So what does Rumford tell him? Rumford says, he says, "Let me tell you a little story, Unk. Let me tell you a little short story. Once upon a time, there was a man being carried from Earth to Mars in a flying saucer. He had volunteered for the army of Mars and already wore the dashing uniform of a lieutenant colonel in the assault infantry of that service. He felt elegant, indeed, having been rather underprivileged spiritually on Earth. So obviously he was overprivileged financially, but underprivileged spiritually. Interesting point that's being made there. He assumed, as spiritually underprivileged persons will, that the uniform said lovely things about him. So he's trying to find meaning in this title, in this rank. He doesn't really, obviously. His memory hadn't been cleaned out yet, and his antenna had yet to be installed. But he was so patently a loyal Martian that he was given the run of the spaceship. The recruiters have a saying about a male recruit like that he has named his balls Deimos and Phobos, said Rumford. Deimos and Phobos being the two moons of Mars. This lieutenant colonel, with no military training whatsoever, was having the experience known on Earth as finding himself. Ignorant as he was of the enterprise in which he was ensnared, he was issuing orders to the other recruits and having them obeyed. Rumford held up his finger, and Unk was startled to see that it was quite translucent, right? So now he's starting to disappear. Rumford is starting to dematerialize. There was one locked stateroom that the man was not permitted to enter. The crew carefully explained to him that the stateroom contained the most beautiful woman ever taken to Mars, and that any man who saw her was certain to fall in love with her. Love, they said, would destroy the value of any but the most professional soldier. This is another thing too, this is another clue. I was saying something to care about. Is this what made Unk a philosopher? Is this what made B a poet? Or was it love, right? Is love the secret sauce? Love, they said, would destroy the value of any but the most professional soldier, right? You're not going to be a brainwashed zombie mindlessly following orders if you passionately love something, because that's what's really going to drive you ultimately. The new lieutenant colonel was offended by the suggestion that he was not a professional soldier, and he regaled the crew with stories of his amatory exploits with gorgeous women, all of which had left his heart absolutely untouched. Sounds like Malachi, right? The crew remained skeptical, pretending to the opinion that the lieutenant colonel had never, for all his lascivious questing, exposed himself to an intelligent, haughty beauty such as the one in the locked stateroom. The crew's seeming respect for the lieutenant colonel was not subtly withdrawn. The other recruits sensed this withdrawal and withdrew their own. The lieutenant colonel in his gaudy uniform was made to feel just like what he really was, after all, a strutting clown. The manner in which he could win back his dignity was never stated, but was obvious to one and all. He could win it back by making a conquest of the beauty locked in the stateroom. He was fully prepared to do this, was desperately prepared. But the crew, said Rumford, continued to protect him from supposed amatory failure and a broken heart. His ego fizzed, it sizzled, it snapped, it crackled, it popped. There was a drinking party in the officers' mess, and the lieutenant colonel became quite drunk and loud. He bragged again about his heartless lewdness on Earth, and then he saw that someone had placed in the bottom of his glass a stateroom key. The lieutenant colonel sneaked away to the locked stateroom forthwith, let himself in, and closed the door behind him. The stateroom was dark, but the inside of the lieutenant colonel's head was illuminated by liquor and by the triumphant words of the announcement that he would make at breakfast the next morning. He took the woman in the dark easily, for she was weak with terror and sedatives. It was a joyless union, satisfactory to no one but Mother Nature at her most callous. The lieutenant colonel did not feel marvelous. He felt wretched. Foolishly, he turned on the light, hoping to find in the woman's appearance some cause for pride in his brutishness. Huddled on the bunk was a rather plain woman past 30. Her eyes were red. Her face was puffy and weeping. Despair. The lieutenant colonel, moreover, knew her. She was a woman that a fortune teller had promised would one day bear his child. She had been so high and proud the last time he saw her, and was now so crushed that even the heartless lieutenant colonel was moved. All right, so this is a heartless man. This is a guy who never gives a shit about anybody and never cared about anything. The first time in his life, he cares about somebody. and he feels ashamed. The lieutenant colonel realized for the first time what most people never realize about themselves, that he was not only a victim of outrageous fortune, but one of outrageous fortune's cruelest agents as well. The woman had regarded him as a pig when they met before. He had now proved beyond question that he was a pig. As the crew had predicted, the lieutenant colonel was spoiled forever as a soldier. He became hopelessly engrossed in the intricate tactics of causing less rather than more pain. Proof of his success would be in his winning of the woman's forgiveness and understanding. So that's really his mission, right? I guess that's what's driving him, and why his mind has to keep getting washed at the hospital. It's because he feels so horrible and he wants to win her forgiveness, right? When the spaceship reached Mars, he learned from loose talk in the reception center hospital that he was about to have his memory taken away. He thereupon wrote himself the first series of letters that listed the things he did not want to forget. The first letter was all about the woman he had wronged. So that's, I guess, one other thing we learn at the end of the chapter is that before all this happened, the woman was a virgin. So this tells us, I think, something about her character too. So we reveal something about the character of Malachi here, but also about her. Remember, she was the girl in the painting. The girl in the painting with the white horse and the white dress and the white gloves, who didn't want to get dirty, right? So she avoids getting her hands dirty, and now she's basically at her worst, right? She's come from this. How does he put it here? You know, the last time he saw her, she had been so high and proud, and she was now so crushed that even the heartless lieutenant colonel was moved. We're going to pretty much skip, I guess, chapter 7, because we're getting short on time here. Chapter 7 describes in detail the invasion of Earth from Mars. But we kind of learn the answer to the question of why the hell are they doing this suicide mission? All these ships start coming to Earth and they're shot down immediately. The only one that is successful, I think, is able to they're able to conquer a butcher market, a meat market in Switzerland or something like that. All the rest of them are murdered. And the last few ships that land, they're all carrying men and old men, women, and children. And so by the time they show up, all the Earthlings know what's going on. Everybody on Earth knows what's going on, and they're shooting up the sky and killing everybody until they realize that they're killing a bunch of invalids, old people, women, children, and then they're like, "Holy crap! What are we doing? What is going on? And what is this all for? Why did all these Martians die? What's the point? Did anybody remember, or do I have to just tell you?" Well, we don't really find out till the end of the book what it was all for, but Rumford thinks that this was all for the better, that Rumford is going to create a new religion on Earth, and once this new religion is established, it's going to create peace on Earth. There'll be no more wars. There'll be no more factions. It'll just be this paradise on Earth. So he thinks it's all worth it in the end, right? This is going to happen. So he, we'll talk about this more next time because we're running out of time. I don't want to rush through all this. We got a few more things to say about chapter 7, kind of Rumford's announcement about this new religion that he's founding and what exactly it entails. And so that's an important point that we'll have to cover next class. But like I said, for next meeting for Monday, make sure you read the next 2 chapters. Even though we didn't finish chapter 7, go on to chapter 8. Read chapter 8 and chapter 9 for Monday. And hallelujah, I think this is our last Zoom meeting. So next week we'll be on campus all week, both Monday and Wednesday, unless they change things between now and then. So I guess keep checking your email. But as far as I know, this is it for Zoom. So I'm going to stop recording. I'll leave the meeting open if y'all have any questions for me. Otherwise, y'all are free to go.